before this video starts, obviously we're going to be discussing Lolita, so I wanted to give a trigger warning for all of this. And because this is a video being made by me, I want to give a trigger warning for a whole lot of this.
You have to be an artist, a madman, full of shame and melancholy and despair, in order to recognize the little deadly demon among the others. Tell me.
Go on, murder me! I'm asking you to murder me!
Lolita.
Where is she?
Simply uttered on its own, the word Lolita conjures up a certain, definitive, but also grossly mistaken image of a young girl who is aware of and overt and manipulative with her own sexuality, transcendent beyond her years. This reading has gained currency through mostly the on-screen adaptations of the Vladimir Nabokov classic, which stands as a cautionary tale about the elusiveness of predatory men within society and how their manipulation extends often beyond their victim to the people around them. However, within the contemporary pop culture landscape, Lolita has become iconic as a racy tale of forbidden love, rather than a sickening tale of child abuse and trauma. This can be observed through the metamorphoses that the canon of Lolita has undergone throughout the age of social media, namely the Dolores Hayes-centered online forums of the early 2000s, and, most importantly, the soft grunge aesthetic of the social media platform Tumblr during the early 2010s. Analysing Lolita and its impact through an aesthetic and critical lens brings to light the reasons for this mistranslation, reflecting how Humbert Humbert was successful in grooming society, his jury, much like he did Dolores Hayes. In 1955, Vladimir Nabokov published arguably one of the most crucial and divisive novels of all time, his magnum opus Lolita, which was printed by the Olympia Press, a small French company most known for their catalogue of erotica. This was much to Nabokov's disdain, but it was the only company willing to publish such a daring work, especially due to the censorship of 1950s society as it pertains to perceived sexual content. The novel was fast to garner controversy and outrage, largely indignantly inflammatory, transforming the tragic story of Humbert and his victim into one of pornographic and salacious infamy. However, within the cultural landscape of 2026, if one were to read Lolita, they may find themselves shocked at its lack of gratuitous or explicitly sexual content given the novel's reputation. I was one of those people when I first devoured the novel at age 14, not too far removed from Dolores' own age, bracing myself for disturbingly graphic content, but instead being faced with tentative and discreet allusions to rape that were almost comforting in their tact, but also raised a burning question. How did this story garner its contemporary reputation? How did a sensitively and beautifully written account of abuse become so synonymous with the obscenely lascivious connotations of Lolita? These queries were instantly put to rest when I viewed Dolores' 2 film appearances, specifically Adrian Lyne's 1997 art house attempt. The disillusionment from Nabokov's masterpiece were painful. The fundamental misinterpretation of the novel's intentions was so far removed that it was almost comical. And the most frustrating part, the film was so close to perfection. As such, it's brought about a plague of misinformation surrounding the story and its source material, and in turn, one of the most fascinating yet distressing cultural conundrums in history. Lolita was first brought to film in 1962 by my personal arch nemesis Stanley Kubrick in a black comedy outfit that is a loose reimagining of the novel's themes and narrative, however, form the framework for the crux of Lolita's misinterpretation. Despite being released to commercial and critical acclaim as one would expect from Kubrick and his perceived caliber of filmmaking, The impact of the Hays Code, bearing ironically similar to the surname of Lolita's own heroine, and its subsequent censorship forced production to lean into the absurdist melodrama of the novel, resulting in a film that successfully executes its individual vision, that of a darkly comedic crime drama, but fails miserably as an adaptation of the novel as well as a commentary on paedophilia. Firstly, Dolores Hays is now 14 and not 12, and attempts to make what is presented as a fully consensual love affair more palatable to the spectator, in turn conveying how society has no qualms of sexualizing 14-year-olds as long as they're not 12-year-olds. And secondly, and perhaps most imperatively, she is no longer Dolores. Lolita no longer becomes the sexually degrading pet name that Humbert assigns her, but an innocent nickname used by even her own mother.
Lolita!
Lolita.
Lolita!
Thus forms the downfall of the film, the romanticization and dulcification of abuse, which can clearly be observed in Adrian Lyne's 1997 adaptation, a film iconic for all the wrong reasons. Adrian Lyne is a director notable for his catalogue of erotic thrillers, such as 1987's Fatal Attraction starring Glenn Close, immediately drawing concern for how he would handle such delicate subject matter, concerns which are validated by the final product of the film. Similarly to the 1962 film, the 1997 installment succumbs to increasing Dolores' age again to 14 in a misguided attempt to make a purposefully shocking aspect of the story less impactful and disturbing. However, unlike Kubrick's Lolita, Lyne's own bastardization was met with extreme commercial failure despite its mixed to fairly positive critical reception, which therefore set the ball in motion for the film to become a cult classic. And that it did. For a film largely ignored and disdained upon release, it has slowly managed to usurp its predecessor and arguably its source material to become, unfortunately, the definitive telling of the story both culturally and aesthetically. While upon the surface this may seem like a surprising and impressive feat, this becomes far more insidious upon closer inspection both in its content and context. This can be observed through the opening visuals of the film and how they are imperative to the gross misframing of the film as a strange and awful love story, as Lyne himself remarks in a 1997 interview.
In the end, it's a love story. It's a strange and awful love story.
The film begins with its end, filled with serene panning shots of a beautiful countryside landscape as the camera tracks Humbert, played by thriller darling Jeremy Irons, who is driving down a road. By beginning the film amidst nature, typically associated with purity and virtue, Lyne can be argued to be aesthetically vindicating Humbert from the film's commencement. This is reinforced by the use of sound, as the lilting piano and strings in conjunction with Irons' softly spoken, non-diegetic narration provides the spectator with such a pleasant distraction from the macabre imagery within the mise-en-scène, such as the police cars hailing Humbert, as well as Humbert's gun and blood-stained hands, implying that he is both literally and figuratively guilty of something. However, its impact is dulcified by the film's tranquil sonic and visual palette. As such, Lyne invites the spectator to see past the darkest symbolism of the sequence, which establishes the motif that the film is a romanticized illusion. This can also be observed in the flashback scene to the death of Humbert's teenage lover Annabelle, the supposed root of his paedophilia, as again the intersection between soundscape and cinematography intentionally deflects the spectator from Humbert's perversions. For example, his non-diegetic voiceover places him in the role of an omniscient narrator, which creates this voice of God effect, framing the film as an observational documentary of his life, unlike the novel where Humbert is a potently unreliable narrator. For example, within the novel, when Humbert first rapes Dolores in the enchanted Hunter's Hotel, he claims that it was she who seduced me, but Nabokov makes it clear that he is presenting this claim to a jury, and therefore attempting to present himself as innocent as possible, whereas in Lyne's adaptation there is no framing device which presents his account of events as unreliable. Humbert states that Dolores initiated sex within the 1997 film, and the spectator is invited to believe him, contributing to the misconstruction that the story is consensual, as the film's narrative is presented as objective rather than subjective, unlike Nabokov's novel. As such, Jeremy Irons' inviting and eloquent vocal delivery in the Annabelle flashback sequence coaxes the spectator to take Humbert's ideology at face value, echoing later scenes containing close-up shots of him typing on a typewriter, another example of how he is the intellectual auteur of the narrative. This, in conjunction with the romanticized visual aesthetics associated with Annabelle, such as the sensual slow-motion camera work, hazy pastel color palette, and white ribbon and lace of her clothes, convey how Lyon is creating the film through the eyes of Humbert. The drawn-out close-up shots of Annabelle undressing, stripping herself of the white and thus pure clothes that she adorned herself with, essentially symbolizes her own sexual corruption and established lines of sexualization and commodification of youth and innocence, easily translatable to wider society's treatment of underage girls, as he manipulates the spectator into pacifying Humbert's degenerate abuse of Dolores later in the film, exacerbated by Annabelle and Dolores sharing visual motifs. This connection and framing are all but flaunted in Lyon's portrayal of the titular character, beginning within the scene where she is introduced. The camera leers over her body, taking on Humbert's perspective, panning salaciously over Dominique Swain as a here 14 rather than 12-year-old Dolores Hayes sprawled on the grass beneath a sprinkler, which turns her white dress sheer and renders her undergarments visible. Lyon carefully constructs this introductory image of Dolores to convey simultaneous innocence and eroticism, as placing her amidst nature, this uncultivated setting untouched by man affords her a demure, virginal and almost nymphic quality, reminiscent of the Nabokovian phrase nymphet, a descriptor for the children that Humbert finds himself sexually attracted to, an ode no doubt unconscious. However, Lyon contrasts this innocence through Dolores' wet, see-through clothing, as the emphasis on her body and the tainting of her white dress with water creates the effect that she is already somewhat impure, echoing his presentation of Annabelle as a sexual child, resulting in the spectator being instantly desensitized to Dolores as an erotic object. Humbert is therefore aesthetically vindicated of his actions. As a result, the spectator's forced habituation to the sexualization of youth makes it far easier for Humbert's actions to be abated as a result, paralleling how survivors of sexual abuse are often dismissed by their peers in real-life scenarios through insinuations that they were asking for it, or shouldn't have been wearing something like that, if they didn't want to encourage sexual attention. This directly correlates with the wider narrative surrounding Lolita that Dolores was consenting in her abuse from Humbert, that she wasn't a victim but a willing participant, going as far as to paint her as a seductress, which not only dilutes the trauma that she experiences, but again, those of many lived survivors. For example, despite Dolores Hayes being a fictionalized child, her suffering captured within the novel draws upon Nabokov's own experiences as a victim of childhood molestation. Therefore, adaptive works that fundamentally misrepresent Dolores Hayes not only do a disservice to her as a character, but to Nabokov as a writer and to sexual abuse survivors as a whole. This makes it abjectly sickening to view how Lyon explicitly idealizes the relationship between Dolores and Humbert, as the camera taking on Humbert's perspective means that the film doesn't aptly challenge how he views Dolores, in a way implicating the spectator in Humbert's crimes. Although it can be inferred that the exploitation of Swain's nude body occupies the dual symbolism of Humbert's degeneracy and Dolores' vulnerability, the lack of emphasis on the latter leads the spectator to align their viewing of Dolores' character with Humbert's views, rather than to sympathize with her as the victim. As such, the camera's relationship with Dolores and the imagery surrounding her shows how Lyon successfully portrays Humbert's ability to manipulate his jury, but at the cost of hypersexualizing and subsequently endangering a real child, Dominique Swain. This intersects with several erotic motifs spread across the film, again beginning in Dolores' introduction with emphatic close-up shots of her feet. This echoes Lyon's intentions to portray Dolores as vulnerable but innocent, yet also desirable. He stresses the importance of showing how Dolores is at that point where she's part child, part woman in Lolita's behind-the-scenes DVD featurette, as bare feet connote a carefree and youthful disposition. However, this is vastly overshadowed by the subliminal eroticism of such imagery, made apparent in the scene where Dolores steps over Humbert, who is sitting on the ground, as the camera intimately tracks her foot brushing against his leg, before immediately cutting to a static wide shot displaying him grinning. The motif of her feet is used to provide Humbert sexual gratification. This is echoed in later sequences through the motif of bananas later in the film. A purposefully unsubtle phallic emblem is used to parallel Dolores' increasing hypersexuality as the film progresses. As Lyon has filmed Lolita through Humbert's eyes, it can be inferred that her crescendoing visual and thematic eroticism reflects Humbert's growing desperation to rationalize his intensifying abuse of her. As he continues to strip her of her innocence, he must hyperbolize her sexuality to maintain his manipulative grip over the spectator. This can be observed through a sequence of Humbert and Dolores driving to the next stop of their Americana road trip. As although Humbert is speaking and not Dolores, Line frantically cuts back to her consuming the symbolic bananas in an extremely suggestive and provocative way. Line's heavy use of jump cuts within this otherwise very passive sequence subtly infers Humbert's waning grip on the jury at this point in the story. Subsequently, the overtly sexual aesthetics of Lolita's motifs solidify Dolores' role within the film not as victim but as temptress. This is another clear indicator of how Adrian Lyne aestheticizes Humbert's abuse of Dolores, this time in order to visualize the manic and disturbing self-rationalization of a paedophile, resulting in the film reigning similar to Lyne's prior filmography of erotic thrillers rather than the crime drama status of the novel. As such, through a broad scope of micro and macro elements, Lyne paradoxically flies in the face of the novel's message by attempting to bring it to screen. By filming Lolita through Humbert's perspective, complete with his persistent and insistent sexual exploitation in an attempt to accurately adapt the novel and the way it's written, he defeats Nabokov's purpose through his inherent inability to portray female victimization without glorification. This hamasha results in a product whose dubious depiction of paedophilia, predation, and discussions of consent can be easily ignored when compared to its admittedly immaculate aesthetics. It becomes all too easy to dismiss its flaws when its hazy, romantic, and almost aspirational imagery of vintage Americana is so tantalizing. It is this aesthetic conundrum which becomes a perfect storm with the introduction of social media and the internet, which epitomizes our human affinity for beauty and iconography devoid of nuance, as the remains of the film's already unstable moral message is fully stripped away until all that is left of Lolita, both the story as well as Dolores Hayes herself, is nothing but a tainted image. Inarguably influenced by the aforementioned aesthetic assassination of Lolita by Adrian Lyne in 1997, the warped image of the story and its titular heroine become the heart of the underground online fan forums surrounding Lolita as a concept and a story, and also, in a way, a brand. While some communities were spearheaded by headstrong teenage girls whose intentions were to protect the legacy of Dolores, most fell into the pitfall of romanticization, largely due to Lyne, himself largely due to Kubrick. As Dolores transcended her initial role as victim into an affluent and idealized symbol of teenage femininity, far removed from her loudly crude and exuberantly unfeminine and asexual demeanor in the original text. The female domination of these forums also raises an interesting mystery in of itself as to why it is that women and girls are the ones who attach themselves so vehemently to the romanticized version of her story. This likely stems from the story's aesthetic mistranslation, as what is left of the novel in pop culture is the imagery of road trips, seduction, bubblegum, heart-shaped sunglasses. That is to say, an illusion of freedom which reigns strangely similar to Dolores' own disposition towards the beginning of the novel. Dolores too had a glossy, saccharine relationship with what she believed she wanted from her schoolgirl crush on Humbert before it was unfortunately translated into a heavily abusive and traumatic reality. Therefore, it can be inferred that the members of these Lolita-based online communities feel a kinship to Dolores as a fellow prepubescent or teenage girl, that of a paradoxical innocence which is burdened by a longing to lose it. Enter my second arch-nemesis, Lana Del Rey. The enchanting vamp of constant sorrow, as she is described as in a Rolling Stone article, whose rise to fame with her iconic conceptual 2012 debut Born to Die is entrenched in references to Lolita, ranging from extremely blunt to the level of subtlety only detectable to those who have obsessively combed over the novel in all of its linguistic splendor. For example, songs such as Giant Mountain Dew reference the contentious heart-shaped sunglasses that never actually appear in the novel or even Kubrick's film despite the iconic poster, or Off to the Races, which uses the opening lines of the book as its pre-chorus, in addition to the album's unambiguously titled bonus track Lolita, which capture her interest in Nabokov's work as much as her clever use of the novel's description of a velvet night in the closing track of the album's standard edition This Is What Makes Us Girls. A wistful meditation on a chaotic and reckless girlhood which fits the contemporary Lolita canon and image to a T. Subsequently, her meteoric success in conjunction with her meticulous use of commercialized Lolita iconography and aesthetics birthed the online aesthetic culture of soft grunge, most prominently on the microblogging social media platform Tumblr, which was directly influenced by imagery of vintage Americana and the ill-construed romance found in Lyne's Lolita, and exacerbated through music which formed the backbone of soft grunge, reflecting how the aestheticized abuse of the film has evolved into the mainstream. raising the question of whether imparting the story through Humbert's eyes so effectively in an effort to replicate the novel was actually the most responsible way to portray the story. The emergence of a musical vessel for teenage girls to engage with Lolita as a purely idealized aesthetic product, combined with Tumblr's predominantly visual formatting, resulted in a culture so iconic and inseparable from the platform and early to mid-2010s youth culture as a whole, whose effects can still be observed today as society's musical contemporaries of the 2020s replicate those elements in their own longing for a different time, a la the 2026 social media trend of replicating the feel of 2016 internet culture. Furthermore, it cemented the death of obscure forums as a place to go for Lolita aesthetics, as soft grunge Tumblr's accessibility, popularity, and role as a fully realized social media experience made it a dominating force. However, an important segregation must be made between the works of artists like Lana Del Rey, whose admittedly analytical and philosophical understanding of the novel results in an authentic and powerful reclamation of the story's narrative as a metaphor for similar situations that Del Rey found herself within her own adolescence, in opposition to others who attempted to bring Lolita and its implications to their own work. For example, Katy Perry famously used definitively Lolita-influenced iconography in her album cover for her debut One of the Boys in 2007. However, as opposed to any meaningful commentary, the imagery of her peering salaciously over dark sunglasses and vintage underwear feels purposefully curated for the male gaze, theorized by feminist philosopher Laura Mulvey as a marketing strategy that exploits and diminishes female anatomy to a vessel for eroticism for a heterosexual male audience. This can perhaps be inferred to be the reason why One of the Boys failed to become a soft grunge staple as opposed to Lana Del Rey's Born to Die, as it lacked an authentically realized connection to Lolita that Tumblr teens yearned for. Soft grunge Tumblr was routinely flooded with an evolved yet just as highly stylized expression of the experience of girlhood which Lolita had come to encompass, such as a heightened emphasis on edginess, whether it be through the iconography of cigarettes or an apathetic suicidality dripping with melancholic mystery and melodrama, posts containing lyrical quotes from soft grunge Tumblr's Holy Trinity, Lana Del Rey, Marina and the Diamonds, and Lorde, or, most crucially, hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of screen caps from Adrian Lyne's Lolita, often cherry-picking the most aesthetically pleasing and romantic visuals. It can be argued that, while rather ironic, girls' affinity for romanticizing their own victimization through this culture reflects a complex and newfound performance of feminism in the face of abusers like Humbert. This creates a fascinating duality between its male counterpart, who too claim emblems of their masculinity, such as Arthur Fleck of 2019's Joker or Patrick Bateman of 2000's American Psycho. However, the ways in which these characters become mouthpieces for men's grievances is vastly juxtapositional to how Dolores Hayes and similar characters are comforts for teenage girls. While Girl's relationship with Lolita and similar works is largely intimate and personal, almost a friendship, men's entanglement with these beacons of traditional masculinity has a far more insidious and obsessive nature to it. They become an aspiration and not a consolation. These men often turn their fanaticism outwards, projecting the messages of patriarchal hegemony, whereas women often internalize the fulfillment that relatable characters like Dolores Hayes offer them. This forms another clear example of the dichotomy between the masculine and feminine response in this scenario, with one being forcibly externalized with no thought on how to self-improve, whereas the other is introspective with the aims to better understand oneself. The crux of soft grunge Tumblr was the catharsis in wallowing in one's own feminine fragility, often playing into the teenage seductress archetype as a coping mechanism for their experiences of emerging into a womanhood they didn't feel ready for. Whether this was an effective, scrupulous, or even responsible strategy is debatable, but it is undeniable that the soft grunge teens found power in the melancholic and tragically romantic. This reflects a trend throughout history, echoing the Victorian affinity for idealizing consumption through a mirage of waifish delicacy, or emphasis on the gloomy, misanthropic, and depressive, which was key to the emergence of the goth subculture in the 1980s. However, here it is fused with the mistranslated themes of feminine innocence and a lust for life, founded by the aestheticization of Lolita. It's arguable that this mistranslation is actually a happy accident, as through it and the music and culture it influenced, a new generation of Dolores Hayes are given the ability to romanticize their way through the most difficult period of their lives. They are afforded a thriving, like-minded community that feels like a reparation for Dolores' isolation and abuse throughout her own adolescence. This is exacerbated by many soft grunge netizens designated themselves as nymphets, an intended reclamation of the initially degrading and perverse descriptor used by Humbert within the novel, which itself burgeoned into a fashion movement known online as nymphet fashion, where people can be seen dressing in a style similar to Dominique Swain and Adrienne Lyon's adaptation, if not directly recreating her outfits, with retailers such as Paylay Shop making one-on-one recreations of her outfits that are ready to purchase worldwide. As such, Lyon's aestheticization of Lolita has invoked a culture, while slightly dubious, if not downright problematic in its presentation, has been reclaimed and recontextualized by girls worldwide into a social movement which embraces the image of female adolescence, however unfortunately contained to these subculture movements, as the dominating cultural understanding of Lolita still follows the misogynistic and pedophilic trajectory that Stanley Kubrick and Adrienne Lyon forged and facilitated. In the year 2026, Lolita, the novel, both films, the character and aesthetic, has evolved with consistent inconsistency. After the soft grunge and nymphet cultures of the early 2010s dissolved due to the rising popularity of competing social media platforms like Instagram and TikTok, which pushed the concept of Lolita and its implication to the fringes of their algorithms, the treatment of the story and its aesthetics followed suit. For example, video essay culture began to spike in prominence on video sharing website YouTube in the late 2010s and skyrocketed to popularity in the early 2020s, which embodies a more philosophical, critical, and nuanced attitude to popular culture, clearly at odds with the simple, blissful ignorance of the nymphets of soft grunge Tumblr, or the Dolores Hayes devotees of the 2000s forums. As such, content creators on the YouTube platform, such as Lola Sebastian, Shan Spear, and Jordan Teresa, achieve success in their more academic approaches to the novel and its subsequent cultural impact, resulting in an internet-wide disparaging of both the novel screen adaptations, with particularly intense contempt for Adrienne Lyon's film, as well as a scorning of soft grunge Tumblr culture as a community that only worsened Lolita's image in the mainstream. For example, Lola Sebastian made fascinating connections within her "We Need to Talk About Lolita" video essay between the way that Lolita is used as an aesthetic symbol to the way that predators, both online and mainstream, weaponize the public's desensitization to grooming and abusive relationships between grown men and little girls, using fellow online creator Onision and famous rapper R. Kelly as her primary examples. This extends to the multitudes of men who follow a homogeneous pattern of implicating the cultural image of Lolita as a smokescreen for criminal behavior, such as Darby Vanity, my third arch-nemesis, frontman of the infamous electronic band Blood on the Dance Floor. Far enough, BOTDF rose to prominence in a culture so far removed from Lolita, that being the emo scene of 2000s MySpace, that it feels impossible for its effects to extend to it. However, this is reflected through Blood on the Dance Floor's 2010 album Epic in the song Horrifically Delicious, where Darby describes the subject of the song as a gothica Lolita girl. While already being a lyric worthy of circumspection upon the surface, it is made additionally tragic through its context, as the song was written about a then 10-year-old child, Damien Leonhardt, whom Darby was sexually abusing. This reflects our contemporary re-examination of Lolita and its cultural impact, as Darby Vanity was investigated net-wide in 2020 and 2021 for the endless list of rape and sexual assault allegations levied at him, the vast majority of which being from women who were underage at the time of his assaults on them, forming an intersection with the recontextualization of Lolita and the exposing of predators that exist within the real world. This satisfyingly creates a parallel between Lolita's current treatment within the mainstream with Nabokov's original intentions for the novel to be an expose of predators and abusers in society, as society is far more conscious of flesh and blood humbits more than ever before. As such, Lolita, despite its turbulent reputation since its initial debut into popular culture in 1955, is finally being treated in accordance with the purpose for it being written. While online communities surrounding Lolita are still active and fruitful to this day, including a small group of resolute soft grunge Tumblr nymphets, to which I am a part of, their engagement with the text and its adaptation and cultural image have skewed far more insightful to Lolita's wider impact beyond their own personal relationships to the story. Furthermore, attitudes to Dolores Hayes as a character have evolved to a protective sense of pity, with many Lolita aficionados emphasizing her role as a victim rather than a seductress, and repairing the perceived damage done by Adrienne Lyon and the occupants of Lolita-influenced internet communities of yesteryear by correcting misconceptions surrounding her character and her story. For example, the Tumblr blog Her Name is Dolores tackled such misconceptions in its name alone, as the myth of Lolita still prevails over Dolores Hayes, the 12-year-old child, as well as closely analysing Nabokov's original text for any semblance of detail that could contribute to demystifying the girl who has now become an emblem of surviving abuse, and relatability and hopefulness for other victims of similar predicaments. I vividly recall the excitement that spread like wildfire across Nymphet Tumblr when the person behind the Her Name is Dolores blog discovered that Dolores Haigh canonically had freckles in the novel, and speculating on her possible bisexuality due to her references to a sexual encounter with another girl. Even such minute details bring so much joy to those who have metamorphosed into truly being able to treat Dolores finally as a human being, not a temptress, not an aesthetic, not a product. And although many misuses of her story are still unfortunately prevalent, such as pop singer Sabrina Carpenter using the same image of Dolores erotically soaked by a sprinkler as Adrienne Lyne did in 1997, we as both an online and wider society are far quicker to criticize those who wish to profit from her pain. And that's the beauty of Lolita's journey in popular culture. Although Dolores tragically perished at the end of the novel, she and her story have prevailed through gross mishandling and trivialization by those who didn't have an adequately intimate understanding of her experiences and pain, and instead sought to turn it into something profitable and lascivious, easily gratifying for the wrong demographic for all the wrong reasons. She remains alive in popular culture with a treatment of the respect that she so desperately deserved but was never afforded. All that I personally am left feeling is that I wish that she could see how much that we love her.